Last time, we explored the theories behind the abandonment of Gedi, the Portuguese who destroyed the trade routes without ever knowing the city existed, the Aramo whose southward migration sent a wave of instability down the East African coast long before their warriors arrived, and the water, the well outside the Grand Mosque that had served the city for centuries, that someone had climbed down into and deepened desperately when the water table began to drop, when the water that had always been there began retreating into the earth as if the city no longer deserved it, and the farewell ritual in the palace, someone arranging small objects on the stone floor before leaving, a carved piece of wood, a smooth stone, a fragment of pottery, a goodbye performed with ceremony and grief by someone who understood they were leaving forever. That was the end of episode 2. This is episode 3, the final episode. This is what happened after the people left. What the 300 years of silence did to Gedi. What the local people believe about what remains in those ruins today. And the one thing about Gedi that nobody talks about because nobody has an answer for it. The thing that Dr. Kirkman noticed on his very first day of excavation and never fully explained. The thing that has made every researcher who has worked at this site describe the same feeling. The feeling that something is still there, waiting. This is where the story of Gedi becomes something more than history. This is where it becomes something else entirely. The people of Gedi walked into the forest in the early 17th century. And then, nothing. No record of their arrival anywhere. No oral tradition in any neighboring community that says here is where the people of Gedi came when they left their city. No trace of 2,500 people settling somewhere new and beginning again. They walked into the Arabuko Sokoke forest and disappeared. I have been thinking about this for a long time, about what it means to disappear not as individuals but as an entire community. As a civilization, individual people disappear from history all the time. The poor, the marginalized, the people who lived on the edges of power and left no written record of their existence. History swallows individuals every day without anyone noticing. But cities do not disappear. Communities do not disappear. 2,500 people, with a palace and 3 mosques and a sophisticated water system and centuries of accumulated knowledge about trade and architecture and governance. They went somewhere. They had to go somewhere. They carried their children and their valuables and their community into the forest and became invisible. The most generous explanation is that they were absorbed into other communities, that they dispersed, that families went different ways, that the community that had existed as a unified city dissolved into the broader population of the East African coast and left no distinct trace because there was no distinct trace to leave. This is possible. It is the most likely practical explanation, but it is also heartbreaking because it means that Gedi as a community, as a civilization, as the particular thing that it was, did not survive the leaving. The people survived, perhaps. Their descendants may live along the Kenyan coast today without knowing that their ancestors built a city with running water and flush toilets and traded with China in the 14th century. But Gedi itself, the community, the knowledge, the particular identity that had been building for 4 centuries, died in the forest, without leaving a record, without leaving a name, without leaving anything except the ruins in the trees. The forest took Gedi back very quickly. This is one of the things that surprises people who study the site. How fast the Arabuko Sokoke reclaimed what the city had taken from it. Within decades of the abandonment, the roofs of the buildings were gone. Timber rots quickly in the tropical heat and humidity. The wooden beams that had supported the stone roofs collapsed and the roofs came down with them, leaving the walls standing. The rooms opened to the sky. Within a generation, the floors were covered in leaf debris, in the accumulating layers of organic matter that the forest produces constantly and without rest. Centimeter by centimeter, year by year, the forest floor rising inside the buildings, burying what had been left behind. Within a century, the trees had moved in. Not small trees, not saplings that grew and could be managed, the massive trees of the Arabuko Sokoke, strangler figs, their roots finding cracks in the stone floors and walls, growing through them, forcing them apart, incorporating the ancient stone into the structure of their root systems until the roots and the walls became one thing, until separating the tree from the building was no longer possible without destroying both. The trees did not damage Gedi accidentally. They incorporated it. They grew into it and through it and around it until the city and the forest became a single organism. The stone walls became part of the trees. The trees became part of the walls in a way that no human construction could have achieved. The forest and the city merged, and in merging, the forest preserved the city. Because the local people were afraid to enter the forest around Gedi, because the old ones kept outsiders away, the city that the forest was swallowing was not disturbed by human hands for 300 years. No looters, no scavengers, no settlers who might have used the cut stone for their own buildings. The forest protected what it was destroying. The contradiction at the heart of Gedi, preserved by the very force that was consuming it. The local people who lived near Gedi for those 300 years of silence were the Giriama, one of the Mijikenda tribes of the Kenyan coast. A community with deep roots in the forest and a complex relationship with the land they shared with the spirits of those who had lived on it before them. The Giriama did not go into the Gedi ruins, not for 300 years, not because they did not know the ruins were there. They knew. They had always known. The ruins were part of their landscape, part of the geography of their lives. They stayed out because of the old ones, the spirits of the priests and leaders of Gedi who had never left, who had walked away from their city in the early 17th century and then walked back, not in the flesh, not as living people, but in the way that the spirits of people who have loved a place deeply are said to return to it. The Giriama had a specific understanding of what the old ones were and what they wanted. They were not malevolent, not primarily. They were protective. They wanted the ruins preserved. They wanted the city they had built and loved and grieved over to remain intact, to remain as close as possible to what it had been. Anyone who entered without proper respect, anyone who damaged the site, who removed artifacts, who treated the ruins as a source of building material or casual curiosity, the old ones would curse them. The Giriama took this seriously, completely seriously, because they had seen what happened to people who disrespected the old ones. The stories were specific and detailed, of people who had taken things from the ruins and experienced misfortune afterward, of people who had damaged the walls and suffered consequences that could not be explained by ordinary cause and effect. The old ones were real to the Giriama in the way that only things you have seen act in the world are real. Not belief in the abstract, not theological doctrine. Evidence. Something in those ruins protected them. Something that Dr. Kirkman felt watching from behind the walls on his first day of excavation. Neither hostile nor friendly. Just waiting. James Kirkman worked at Gedi for more than a decade. From 1948 to the late 1950s, he became the world's leading expert on the site, on the architecture, on the artifacts, on the history of the Swahili coast. He was a careful man, a scholarly man, a man who dealt in evidence and documentation and peer-reviewed conclusions. He was not a man given to fanciful thinking, and yet, he wrote repeatedly about the atmosphere of Gedi in a way that his scholarly training could not fully contain. He wrote about the feeling of being watched, of a presence in the ruins that was not hostile but was not comfortable either, of the sense that the excavation was being permitted rather than simply proceeding. Other researchers who worked at Gedi after Kirkman described similar experiences. Not dramatic experiences, not apparitions or voices or anything that could be pointed to and documented. just a persistent low-level awareness of something present that was not any of the researchers or their assistants. The archaeologist who excavated the palace in the 1970s wrote in her field notes, "I have worked at archaeological sites across East Africa for 20 years. I have never felt at any of them what I feel at Gedi. The closest I can come to describing it is this. At other sites, I feel like I am investigating the past. At Gedi, I feel like the past is investigating me." She was a scientist, a rigorous and skeptical researcher whose published work contained nothing of this kind. It was in her personal field notes only. "There is one more thing I want to tell you about Gedi. One thing that nobody has been able to explain. One thing that sits at the center of the mystery and has no answer. In the inner city, in the area enclosed by the inner wall where the elite of Gedi lived, where the palace and the grand mosque and the finest houses stood, there are tombs, the tombs of the Imams, of the religious leaders of the city. Beautiful tombs, tall stone pillars marking the graves, the characteristic style of Swahili burial that is found all along the East African coast. These tombs are elaborate. They are clearly the work of skilled craftsmen who took great care with the construction. They were meant to last, and they have lasted through the abandonment, through the 300 years of forest growth, through the excavations of the 20th century. They stand today in the inner city of Gedi, the most intact structures on the site. But here is what nobody can explain. The dates on the tombs do not match the history of the site. Some of the tombs are dated to periods after the supposed abandonment of the city, after the city was empty, after the people had left. There are burials at Gedi that occurred in a city that was supposed to have no one in it. Someone came back to Gedi after the abandonment, or someone never left, and buried their dead in the empty city, with the full ceremony and craftsmanship of the Swahili burial tradition. Who was burying people in an empty city, who came back to bury their dead in the ruins of a place that everyone else had left? This question has no answer, and it is the question I cannot stop thinking about. I want to end this story the way it deserves to be ended, not with theories, not with academic conclusions, not with a neat explanation that ties everything together and makes the mystery manageable, but with the truth. The truth is that we do not know what happened to the people of Gedi. We do not know exactly why they left. We have theories, reasonable theories, well supported by evidence. The Portuguese and the Arabuko and the falling water table and the convergence of pressures that made staying impossible. But we do not know. We do not know where they went. We do not know if they survived the years after leaving, if they built a new community somewhere in the forest or on the coast, if they dispersed into other communities or tried to stay together. We do not know. We do not know who arranged the objects on the palace floor before the final departure. We do not know what words were said, what prayers were offered, what the person who performed that farewell ritual felt as they performed it. We do not know. We do not know who came back to bury their dead in the empty city. We do not know how many times someone returned. For what purpose? With what grief? We do not know. What we know is this: a civilization existed on the Kenyan coast for 400 years. It built a city with running water and flush toilets and a palace and 3 mosques and connections to the entire known world. It traded and grew and organized itself and developed an architecture and a culture that we are still studying today and still do not fully understand. And it left, quietly, deliberately, with ceremony and grief and the careful arrangement of small objects on a stone floor. And the forest grew over what it had built. And 300 years passed. And when the world finally found Gedi again, buried under the roots of strangler figs and the accumulated centuries of leaf debris, the city was still there, not gone, not destroyed, not erased, just waiting, the way the old ones wait behind the walls, neither hostile nor friendly, patient, For what they know is going to happen. For someone to find them, to dig through the centuries of silence and find the well that was deepened in desperation, and the objects arranged in farewell, and the tombs of the people who came back to bury their dead in an empty city. For someone to stand in the ruins of Gedi and feel what James Kirkman felt on his first day. That something is looking out from behind the walls, not hostile, not friendly, just here, still here, after everything, still here. This has been the lost city of Gedi, the true story of Africa's most mysterious abandoned city, based on historical records, archaeological findings, and the testimony of researchers who spent years in those ruins and felt something they could not explain. If the story made you feel the weight of what is lost when a civilization disappears without leaving a name, then it has done what it was meant to do. This has been Gray Archive Tales. Subscribe and stay in the shadows. We will be here, waiting, the way Gedi waits, the way it has always waited.